Hashtag the Battle of Stalingrad, Bloodiest Fight of WW2. A cinematic historical documentary script. August 23, 1942. 4 p.m. The summer sun hung merciless over the Volga River, turning its broad waters into molten copper. Along the western bank, the city of Stalingrad stretched like a jagged crown, factories belching smoke, apartment blocks casting long shadows across boulevards named for revolution and progress. In the workers' districts, women queued for bread with handkerchiefs pressed to their foreheads. Children played in courtyards where laundry fluttered like tattered flags. The air tasted of dust and diesel, of industry, and the particular metallic promise of a storm that would not break. Then, at precisely 4 p.m., the sky cracked open. 600 Luftwaffe aircraft, Heinkel bombers, Junkers dive bombers, Stuka sirens screaming like mechanical banshees, descended upon the city in waves. The bombs fell in curtains of fire. Wooden houses exploded into kindling. Oil storage tanks erupted in columns of flame that licked 200 feet into the air, turning afternoon into a hellish twilight. The river Volga itself seemed to burn as petroleum spread across its surface, and for the first time in human history, water became fire. In basements and shelters, families huddled as the earth shook, as the foundations of their world, literal and metaphorical, crumbled to dust. By nightfall, 40,000 civilians lay dead. Stalingrad, named for the Soviet leader himself, the city that symbolized the revolution's industrial might, was burning. But this was not simply destruction. This was the opening move in what would become the single bloodiest battle in human history, a struggle so vast, so savage, so utterly consuming that it would devour entire armies and redefine the very meaning of warfare. Over the next 5 months and 14 days, more than 2 million soldiers and civilians would become casualties in this crucible along the Volga. The battle would transform concrete apartment blocks into fortresses, factory floors into graveyards, and human beings into ghosts who fought through winter blizzards for possession of a single staircase, a single room, a single brick. Stalingrad would become more than a battle. It would become a word that meant the end of illusions, the death of invincibility, and the turning point of the Second World War. To understand how this apocalypse came to pass, one must step back to June 22, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers, along with their Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, and Finnish allies, smashed across the Soviet border in the largest invasion force ever assembled. Operation Barbarossa, named for a medieval emperor, was Hitler's gambit to destroy the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign. The Führer and his generals believed the rotten structure of Stalin's regime would collapse within weeks. They believed the Soviet people, oppressed by Bolshevism, would welcome liberation. They believed their Wehrmacht, having conquered Poland in weeks and France in 6 weeks, represented a new kind of military perfection: blitzkrieg warfare, lightning war, an unstoppable combination of armor, aircraft, and infantry moving with mechanical precision. And at first, their confidence seemed justified. In the opening weeks, entire Soviet armies were surrounded and annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers marched into German captivity, columns of defeated men stretching to the horizon. By September 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Leningrad in the north and had driven deep into Ukraine. Moscow itself seemed within grasp as panzer divisions advanced to within sight of the Kremlin's spires. The Soviet Union appeared to be dying, bleeding to death from 1,000 wounds. But it did not die. The winter of 1941 arrived early and vicious. Temperatures plummeted to 40 below zero. German soldiers, equipped for a summer campaign, froze in their positions. Tank engines seized. Machine guns refused to fire. Frostbite claimed more casualties than Soviet bullets. And still, somehow, the Red Army counterattacked at Moscow, driving the Wehrmacht back from the capital in the first German defeat of the war. The invincible machine had been stopped. But Hitler, unable to accept this humiliation, unwilling to acknowledge the limits of his power, planned a new offensive for 1942, not toward Moscow again, but south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus that fueled the Soviet war machine. And directly in the path of this southern offensive lay Stalingrad. The city was not chosen for its strategic value alone, though it controlled river traffic on the Volga and housed factories producing tanks and weapons. It was chosen because of its name. For Hitler, to capture Stalin's city would be a symbolic triumph, proof that the Soviet dictator's power was hollow. For Stalin, to defend his namesake city became a matter of personal and political survival. He issued Order No. 227 in July 1942, not one step back. Soviet soldiers who retreated without orders would be shot. Special blocking detachments were positioned behind frontline units with instructions to machine gun anyone who fled. The penalty for cowardice was death. The penalty for survival was fighting. There was no third option. Into this equation marched the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, a staff officer of meticulous habits and rigid thinking, a man who obeyed orders with mechanical precision and never questioned the strategy handed down from above. His army, numbering over 270,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, advanced towards Stalingrad in August 1942 with the same confidence that had carried them from the Polish border to the Volga's edge. They expected resistance, certainly. They expected the Soviets to fight. But they expected to win because they had always won. The rubble that awaited them would teach a different lesson. The soldiers of the Sixth Army had spent a year in the East, a year of victories mixed with a growing unease that had no name. They had expected quick triumph, parades through defeated cities, grateful populations. Instead, they had found vast emptiness, partisan attacks in the forests, villages burned to ash, and an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat even in the face of overwhelming odds. They had been told the Slavic peoples were inferior, weak, destined for slavery or extinction. But the men they captured, the soldiers who staggered from encircled positions, starved and exhausted, often showed not despair but a strange, unbreakable stubbornness. Something in the Russian landscape and the Russian soul resisted classification, resisted the neat categories of Nazi ideology. But these doubts remained unspoken, buried beneath military discipline and the camaraderie of shared hardship. As they approached Stalingrad in the late summer heat, German soldiers could see the smoke from the burning city from 50 kilometers away. The bombing had created a wasteland of rubble where buildings once stood. They thought this was good, easier to advance through ruins than through defended streets. They were wrong. What the Luftwaffe had done, inadvertently, was transform Stalingrad into a defender's paradise. Every pile of rubble became a firing position. Every ruined building became a fortress. Every crater offered cover. The Germans had destroyed the city only to discover that destruction favored the defender in ways no military manual had anticipated. The Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, a blunt, profane veteran who had survived Stalin's purges through sheer competence and luck, established his headquarters in a series of dugouts carved into the Volga's western bank. Chuikov understood immediately that conventional warfare was impossible in Stalingrad's ruins. Instead, he ordered his troops to hug the Germans, to stay so close to enemy positions that the Luftwaffe could not bomb without hitting their own men. He organized small combat groups of 6 to 10 soldiers armed with grenades, submachine guns, and knives. Their mission was not to hold territory, but to make the Germans pay in blood for every meter. He called this rat warfare, and it would become the defining characteristic of the battle. By September, the fighting had reached a pitch of intensity that veterans of the First World War found difficult to comprehend. Individual buildings became battlefields where combat raged for days or weeks. The Pavlov House, a 4-story apartment block, was held by a sergeant named Yakov Pavlov and his platoon for 58 days against continuous German assault. They fortified the basement, punched holes through walls to create firing positions, and turned the structure into a miniature fortress. German infantry attacked it repeatedly, sometimes supported by tanks firing point-blank through windows. The Russians held. Not because they were ordered to, though orders existed, but because surrender meant capture and German treatment of Soviet prisoners ranged from neglect to murder. Between dying in place and dying in a camp, many chose the former. But more than that, something deeper had taken root, a savage determination that had no rational explanation, only the momentum of its own fury. The grain elevator on the southern edge of the city became another monument to this new kind of warfare. 50 Soviet soldiers held it against an entire German division for 5 days. When the Germans finally stormed the structure, they found 18 survivors, black with soot, half mad with thirst, still shooting. The Red October factory, the Barricadi gun factory, the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, each became its own battlefield where workshops and assembly lines turned into trenches, where men fought in darkness lit only by muzzle flashes, where the dead piled in corners because there was no time or space to bury them. The smell of Stalingrad became a thing survivors would remember decades later. Cordite and brick dust and rotting flesh and burning oil, a stench that soaked into clothing and hair and could not be washed away. For German soldiers, Stalingrad became a psychological nightmare beyond anything their training had prepared them for. They had been taught to fight in the open, to use combined arms tactics, to maneuver and flank and break through. But here, there was no open ground. There were no flanks. There was no breakthrough. There was only forward, meter by bloody meter, house by house, room by room. A soldier might fight all day to capture a single floor of a building, only to discover at night that Soviet infiltrators had recaptured the basement below him. Position became meaningless. Front lines ceased to exist in any coherent sense. Germans and Russians occupied different floors of the same building, separated by rubble and darkness and a few wooden beams. The personal accounts from German soldiers in Stalingrad reveal a transformation in consciousness that military historians would spend decades analyzing. Lieutenant Wiener wrote in a letter home in October 1942, "Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." The comparison is telling. Even animals flee, but men remain, not because they are braver than animals, but because they have been trapped by forces larger than survival instinct, ideology, discipline, fear of courts-martial, and a momentum that carried them forward even when reason screamed retreat. Another soldier, Wilhelm Hoffmann, kept a diary that survived his death. In September, he wrote, "Our battalion is lucky and still has almost 80 men. We are occupying a house on the corner of the square. The streets are dead. Not a single civilian. The dogs have gone. It is all rubble and shell craters." By October, our regiment has been so badly battered that it can hardly be called a regiment anymore. We are being mowed down like grass. By November, our regiment has now lost all its battalions. We are being destroyed. This is not war. This is not even hell. Hell cannot be this bad. Then silence. Hoffmann's body was later found in the ruins, his diary beside him, a testament to the gradual erosion of certainty that Stalingrad inflicted on those who fought there. The Germans had expected to face an inferior enemy, poorly trained and equipped, demoralized by defeats and Stalin's purges. Instead, they encountered soldiers who fought with a ferocity that bordered on fanaticism. Soviet troops were indeed often poorly trained, especially the reinforcements rushed across the Volga at night under German fire. Many arrived with minimal ammunition, told to take weapons from the dead. But they also brought with them something the Germans had not calculated: desperation mixed with purpose. They were not fighting for Stalin alone, though propaganda played its role. They were fighting for the soil beneath their feet, for cities and villages and families somewhere beyond the front, for the half-articulated belief that this ground must not be given, not another meter, not one more step back. The symbol that came to define this clash of expectations was not a weapon or a flag, but something more mundane and more profound: bread. Specifically, the ration of black bread that Soviet soldiers received, when they received it at all. often only 300 grams per day, sometimes less. This dense, sour loaf became the measure of survival. German soldiers, whose supply lines still functioned through most of the autumn, received better rations, white bread, meat, even occasional luxuries from home. But as October turned to November, as the Volga began to freeze and Soviet logistics improved while German supply routes stretched to breaking, the equation shifted. Soviet soldiers, huddled in cellars and ruins, would break their bread ration into pieces, eating a little at a time to make it last. They shared it with wounded comrades, hoarded crumbs in pockets as a hedge against tomorrow. German soldiers, watching from nearby positions, began to realize that these men they had been taught to despise as subhuman were fighting on less food, less ammunition, less of everything, and yet they fought. The bread became a symbol of endurance, of a system that, however brutal and inefficient, could still deliver enough sustenance to keep men in the line. For the Germans, their superior rations became a bitter irony. They ate better but were losing. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army had pushed Soviet forces into a narrow strip of land along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters deep. General Paulus reported to Hitler that the city was nearly captured, that one final push would finish the job. Hitler, desperate for victory, ordered him to continue, to take the city regardless of casualties. And so the attacks continued, gaining meters at the cost of battalions. On November 11th, German troops reached the Volga itself at the southern end of the city, planting their flag on the riverbank. For a moment, it seemed that victory was within grasp, that Stalin's city would fall, that the German line would stretch unbroken from Norway to the Caspian Sea. But that same day, far to the north and south of Stalingrad, in the barren steppe where only scrubland and empty sky existed, Soviet forces were massing for an operation that would change everything. For months, while the world's attention focused on the rubble-choked streets of Stalingrad, Soviet commanders Zhukov and Vasilevsky had been planning Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment designed to surround and destroy the German Sixth Army. They had quietly assembled over 1 million troops, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and positioned them against the weakest points in the Axis line, the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, Allied forces equipped with inferior weapons and lacking the fanaticism of German units. On November 19th, in temperatures already dropping below freezing, the northern pincer struck. Soviet artillery, thousands of guns firing in coordinated fury, pulverized Romanian positions. Then came the tanks, T-34s that outmatched the Romanian anti-tank weapons, followed by waves of infantry. The Romanian line, stretched thin and lacking support, disintegrated within hours. The following day, the southern pincer attacked with equal success. Within 4 days, the two Soviet spearheads met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad, completing the encirclement. The German Sixth Army, the finest formation in Hitler's military, the sword that had cut through Poland and France and driven to the gates of Moscow, this army was now surrounded, trapped with its back to the Volga in the ruins of the city it had almost captured. In his headquarters, General Paulus confronted an impossible situation. His army of over 250,000 men was cut off, encircled by Soviet forces. The logical response, the military solution every staff college taught, was to break out immediately before the Soviet ring solidified, to retreat west and re-establish the German line further back. His corps commanders urged this course. But Hitler forbade it. The Führer, from his headquarters 1,000 miles away, declared that the Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad, that Luftwaffe supply planes would sustain them, that a relief force would break through to rescue them. And Paulus, that obedient staff officer who had never disobeyed an order, chose to obey. The Luftwaffe attempted to fulfill Hitler's promise, but the mathematics of aerial supply made it impossible from the start. The Sixth Army required a minimum of 750 tons of supplies per day to survive and function. The Luftwaffe, at its peak, delivered less than 100 tons daily and often far less as Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire took their toll. The transport planes became flying coffins. Dozens were shot down, hundreds were damaged, and what did get through brought a fraction of what was needed. Soldiers watched the sky, heard the drone of engines, and saw parachutes descending with containers that held ammunition but not enough food, or medical supplies but not enough ammunition, or letters from home but not the reinforcements they needed. As December progressed, the temperature plummeted to 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The Russian winter, which had stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow a year earlier, returned with savage force. German soldiers, still in threadbare summer uniforms supplemented with whatever they could scavenge, began to freeze. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, noses, ears. Weapons froze and required fires to thaw before they could function. Horses died by the thousands, and their frozen carcasses were butchered for meat. The daily ration shrank, first to half, then to a quarter, then to starvation levels. Men became gaunt, hollow-eyed, their thoughts consumed by food fantasies and the cold that never relented. An attempted relief operation in December, led by Field Marshal von Manstein's Army Group Dawn, came within 35 kilometers of the Stalingrad pocket before being halted by fierce Soviet resistance and deteriorating weather. Paulus was ordered to remain in place rather than attempt to break out toward the relief force. The opportunity passed. By early January 1943, the Sixth Army's position had become untenable. Ammunition dwindled. Fuel reserves ran dry, immobilizing the remaining tanks and vehicles. The wounded piled up in makeshift hospitals without heat or medicine, suffering amputations without anesthesia, dying slowly of gangrene and shock. The stench of death permeated every position. Soviet forces, meanwhile, tightened the noose. They launched Operation Ring on January 10, 1943, a systematic reduction of the German pocket from all sides. Block by block, ruin by ruin, they compressed the Sixth Army into smaller and smaller pockets. German resistance, though fierce in places, became increasingly fragmented. Units lost contact with headquarters. Orders ceased to arrive. Soldiers fought because there was nothing else to do, or huddled in cellars waiting for the end, or staggered through snowdrifts searching for food that didn't exist. The contrast between what these German soldiers had expected and what they experienced could not have been more absolute. They had marched into the Soviet Union as conquerors, as representatives of what they were told was a superior civilization bringing order to the barbaric East. They had expected the enemy to collapse, the terrain to yield, the campaign to conclude with parades and medals. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a frozen ruin, starving and exhausted, fighting an enemy who refused to quit, in a city whose very name mocked their failure. The city of Stalin. They had come to erase it from the map. Instead, it had erased them. On January 31, 1943, the southern pocket of the Sixth Army, now reduced to the ruins of a department store basement, surrendered. General Paulus, recently promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler in a cynical gesture, no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, the implication being that Paulus should commit suicide rather than face capture, chose life over death, and became a prisoner. Over the next 2 days, the remaining pockets surrendered one by one. Of the 250,000 German and Axis soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity. They were skeletal figures in rags, hollow-eyed and lice-ridden, shuffling through the snow past the corpses of their comrades. Newsreel footage of these surrenders shocked the world. These were the supermen of Nazi propaganda, the invincible Wehrmacht, and they looked like ghosts. The fate of those 91,000 prisoners became its own nightmare. Transported to camps across Siberia and Central Asia, subjected to forced labor, inadequate food, and brutal conditions, only about 6,000 would survive to return to Germany over the next decade. The rest died of disease, starvation, exhaustion, or execution. The graves scattered across the Soviet Union, unmarked pits in frozen earth, became the final resting place of men who had once believed they were destined to rule the world. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the turning point, the moment when defeat turned to hope, when survival became conceivable. The victory came at a staggering cost: over 1 million Soviet casualties, soldiers and civilians, dead or wounded or missing. But it was a cost Stalin was willing to pay, and for many Soviet citizens, It was a cost that gave meaning to the suffering they had endured since 1941. The city of Stalingrad, or what remained of it, became a symbol of resistance, proof that the Nazi machine could be broken, that the tide of the war could turn. In Germany, the news of the Sixth Army's destruction was received with shock that bordered on disbelief. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Church bells tolled across the Reich. The myth of German invincibility, carefully constructed through 2 years of victories, shattered. Families who had received letters from sons and husbands in Stalingrad in December received no more letters. The questions began. How could this happen? Why were they not rescued? Who was responsible? These questions had no good answers, and so they were drowned in propaganda about heroic sacrifice and treacherous enemies. But doubt, once planted, could not be entirely uprooted. The transformation that Stalingrad wrought extended far beyond casualty figures and strategic maps. It changed the psychological balance of the war. Soviet soldiers who survived Stalingrad carried with them the knowledge that they could defeat the Wehrmacht in sustained combat, that German soldiers could be outfought, outlasted, and destroyed. This knowledge spread through the Red Army like a current, stiffening resolve, providing evidence that the sacrifices demanded by Stalin and his commanders could yield results. The victories that followed, Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, the drive to Berlin, all trace their lineage back to the ruins of Stalingrad. For German soldiers elsewhere on the Eastern Front, the news from Stalingrad introduced a corrosive doubt. If the Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's best formations, led by experienced officers, equipped and supplied, could be annihilated, then what did that mean for their own chances? The confidence that had carried them from victory to victory began to erode, replaced by a grim awareness that this war would not end quickly, that the promises of easy triumph had been lies, and that the enemy they faced was not inferior, but desperately, savagely determined. The letters home began to change in tone, less triumphant, more weary, filled with requests for warm clothing and news from home, and an undertone of resignation that had not been present before. The city of Stalingrad itself, that collection of ruins along the Volga, had become something more than geography. It had become a word that carried weight, a symbol that transcended its tactical importance. For the Soviets, it meant that the Great Patriotic War could be won, that the fascist invaders could be driven from Soviet soil. For the Germans, it meant the beginning of the end, the first great defeat that could not be spun as a strategic withdrawal or a temporary setback. And for the watching world, the Americans and British in the West, the Japanese in the East, the neutral nations trying to predict which side would prevail, Stalingrad meant that the outcome of the war was no longer certain, that the Nazi Empire had limits, that history had not ended with German victory. The bread that Soviet soldiers had rationed so carefully through those desperate months became, in memory and in propaganda, a symbol of socialist resilience. Where the Germans had expected abundance, they found scarcity. Where they had expected grateful submission, they found resistance. The simple act of breaking bread in a frozen cellar while artillery thundered overhead became an act of defiance, proof that people could endure more than the comfortable theorists of Berlin believed possible. The ideological certainty that had driven the Wehrmacht eastward, the belief that Slavic peoples were inferior, that Bolshevism was weak, that German organization and will would prevail, shattered against the reality of men who fought on less and yet fought harder. Stalingrad stands in history as a monument to the costs of war, to the suffering of soldiers and civilians caught in the machinery of great power conflict, and to the stubborn, inarticulate courage of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It stands as a warning about the dangers of ideological certainty, about the gap between expectation and reality that yawns widest in wartime, and about the way that symbols, a city's name, a piece of bread, a frozen river, can carry meanings far beyond their physical substance. The Volga still flows past the city now called Volgograd, renamed in the de-Stalinization of the 1960s, but forever linked in memory to that winter battle. Its waters reflect the same sky that turned red with fire in 1942, but they flow peacefully now, carrying commercial traffic and summer tourists. The factories have been rebuilt, the apartments reconstructed, the streets filled again with ordinary life. But beneath that surface, visible only to those who know where to look, the traces remain. The memorial complex, the preserved ruins, the plaques marking where regiments made their stands, and the simple knowledge that this ground once defined the limits of conquest and the price of freedom. In the end, Stalingrad teaches a truth that every generation must relearn, that freedom and survival are purchased with sacrifice, that certainty is the first casualty of contact with reality, and that the human capacity for endurance, when tested beyond all reasonable limits, sometimes reveals a strength that no ideology can fully explain or predict. The soldiers who fought there, German and Soviet alike, learned that lesson in the most direct and terrible way possible. Their experience, preserved in letters and diaries and official histories and fading memories, stands as testimony to what happens when nations commit themselves wholly to war, when compromise becomes impossible, and when the only choices left are to fight or to die. Stalingrad was the place where those choices were made, where the bloodiest battle of the bloodiest war in human history was fought to its bitter conclusion, and where the future was written in ruins and blood and snow along the banks of an ancient river. Yendi, 6,247 words.